Hi, I'm Jeremy Knindike, and you're listening to Forced from Home, a podcast about global displacement. The now 2-month-old Ebola outbreak in eastern Congo continues to explode and is on track to become one of the worst, if not very possibly the worst, Ebola outbreak that the world has ever seen. As of July 18th, the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo reported 2,344 confirmed cases. Of the known cases that have reached the end of their infection, 466 people have recovered and 930 have died. If you're paying attention, that means deaths are outpacing recoveries by about 2 to 1 at this point. That is a really worrying ratio and would put it on the higher end of Ebola outbreaks in recent years. Also, very worryingly, the World Health Organization says that they think the actual number of Ebola cases out there is likely anywhere from 2 to 4 times as higher than that figure, which would put it anywhere from 5 to 10,000 cases in reality. These are people who are not part of known contact tracing lists, who have not come onto the radar screen before as people who've been exposed to Ebola. And that's really worrying because the way ultimately that you get an Ebola outbreak under control is by identifying contacts quickly, getting them into isolation, and preventing them from spreading it to others. This is going to be one of the most difficult Ebola outbreaks ever to contain for a few reasons. First, it's happening in the midst of a major humanitarian and displacement emergency in eastern Congo. Eastern Congo has had conflict ongoing for many years in different regions. There are about 3.5 million internally displaced people in the provinces that are affected by this Ebola outbreak. And so it is a very turbulent, very difficult operating environment on a good day, much less in the midst of an outbreak. Second, this is a different species of Ebola than what we are used to seeing. So this is the Bundibugyo species, not the Zaire or Sudan species. Most past Ebola outbreaks have been Zaire or Sudan. And that's relevant because the tools that we use to fight them, the vaccines, the medical countermeasures like treatments and diagnostic testing, are geared towards those other species of Ebola. So as we enter the fight here, we do not have at our disposal rapid field diagnostics tests. We do not have a proven vaccine. We do not have proven therapeutic treatments for this species of Ebola, although there are now some very rapid trials getting underway to try and develop and prove those as quickly as possible. And third, and very importantly, many of the global institutions that have been key to fighting Ebola in the past are badly weakened, if not outright gone. So USAID, of course, which led past U.S. responses to Ebola, including the one that I was involved in 2014 in West Africa. USAID is completely gone. The World Health Organization is still there, but the U.S. has withdrawn. The U.S.'s money is gone. Other donors have cut their funding. World Health Organization has had to lay off thousands of staff over the past year and a half. And of course, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have also taken big hits over the past year, losing many staff, particularly their global-facing staff, due to the DOGE layoffs. So it is a really challenging picture. We're going to dive into multiple aspects of that in the course of this episode today. We're talking to Dr. Craig Spencer, who is an emergency medical physician who has served on Ebola responses in the past with Doctors Without Borders and is also himself an Ebola survivor after having gotten the disease while treating patients in Guinea in 2014. We will also talk to Mvemba Dizolele about the backdrop of conflict and political challenges in eastern Congo within which this outbreak response is playing out. And stick around at the end for a quick news roundup of a few other headlines that we're tracking this week. I want to welcome my friend, Dr. Craig Spencer, to the show. Craig is an emergency medicine physician and a professor at the Brown University School of Public Health. He has 2 decades of experience in humanitarian response. He's worked across Africa and Southeast Asia as a field epidemiologist and providing medical treatment in many places. You have probably seen him on CNN or read him in the New York Times. Craig is one of the smartest and most empathetic voices out there. on outbreak issues. And when it comes to Ebola, he has another level of insight. He is himself a survivor of the disease after he was exposed while treating Ebola patients in Guinea in 2014 and famously went bowling in New York City, which got a few headlines before coming down with it himself. So there's no one better to join us. So Craig, welcome. We're really thrilled to have you with us.
Jeremy, I'm excited to be here. And I just wanted to say at the outset, thanks, because I don't think we met in 2014 because I think we were both busy doing our different things. But I think
we both had a lot on our plates that year.
We had a lot on our plates, but I met a lot of your colleagues that helped with that response then. And you probably weren't thinking a decade ago that I'm sure you were hoping that a decade later we wouldn't be in the same spot. We would learn those lessons. But here we are. So I think there's a lot that we can unpack from what's going on and think about what this looks like going forward. So thanks for having me. And thanks for all the work you've done in your role now, but also with USAID and others beforehand.
Well, let's start with that. It is weird to be still talking about this virus on a massive scale 10 plus years on from when that outbreak ended. So let's start with the basics. How does Ebola spread? What are the symptoms? What happens to someone when they get infected? Kind of just walk us through the 101.
Yeah, Ebola is what I call a disease of compassion because it infects the people who show up when other people run away. And that will be family members. So the mom who takes care of her father or her kids when they get sick. It'll be the healthcare workers that continue to show up, even if they don't have the personal protective equipment needed to prevent themselves getting infected. We know that it's not a particularly transmissible virus. It's actually kind of poor. It's not like measles or it's not like COVID and that you can be in a room and share the same air. This is a disease that is spread by close contact, by bodily fluids, by blood, by other things, often from patients that have the wet phase of the illness where they're vomiting or having diarrhea. So these are people that are close. That's why even right now, there is this R naught of 1.4, meaning that 10 people have it are passing it on to 14 people. It's not remarkably efficient in terms of transmission, but it is unfortunately remarkably lethal. Around 40 to 80% of people who get Ebola will end up dying. So that is why it's so important for us to try to find the transmission chains where it's spreading, to help the healthcare providers and the people on the front lines in the family or in the clinics, provide them with the right protection, whether that is personal protective equipment, vaccines if we have them, to make sure that we're able to prevent this from going any further, because each extra case is essentially a coin flip in terms of whether or not they survive it.
Yeah, and those transmission dynamics, I think, are not well understood by the general public. There's this sense of, oh my God, it's this incredibly aggressive virus. And it is under very certain circumstances. You know, in your normal day-to-day life, you're not touching too many other people's bodily fluids, and that is how it spread. And so, you know, as a survivor, how did you get exposed and what was your experience with battling the infection?
Yeah, so I showed up in September of 2014 in Guinea. I was sent to Guinea because I was convinced I was going to play hockey for the Montreal Canadiens as a goalie. So I figured I'd learn French as a younger lad. I didn't play goalie, so I had no idea why I thought I was going to play goalie for the Montreal Canadiens. But I learned French, which is why I got sent to Guinea. And I was there taking care of patients in an Ebola treatment unit for Doctors Without Borders at a point in the outbreak when the physics, the dynamics of it were really taking off, if you remember, in late 2014.
Yeah, that was the most aggressive phase.
Yeah, we're seeing people outside of treatment units. There were not enough beds. And I was inside those units taking care of patients. I was providing medical care, going in full personal protective equipment with my colleagues, almost all of which were from Guinea, the smartest people I've ever worked with, Dr. Mode, Dr. Keita, local infectious disease docs from Guinea who had showed up every single day since the start of the outbreak. I showed up in September. They were there since March. I was exposed and infected at some point in that process, presumably. I don't know exactly when I got sick. I'd never had a breach in my protective equipment up until the point that I was in Belgium en route to Guinea. An international staff for Doctors Without Borders had never been infected with Ebola because our protocols are pretty severe and pretty stringent, and that every single time you leave an Ebola treatment center taking care of patients, you follow the same steps. And it is not you that decides them. There is an actual dedicated person there who tells you what to do every single step because you are tired, you're exhausted, you're dehydrated. You come out and flip over your boot and a liter of water comes out. Your mental capacity isn't 100%. I'd go in at 7 a.m. I'd spend an hour and a half inside the treatment unit in a Tyvek suit, non-breathable, double gloves, a hood, an N95, a mask outside my N95, goggles, and then an apron. And then the process for putting them on is complicated. Taking care of patients is scary, of course, but it's actually at the doffing process, taking everything off that you're at greatest risk. So most people I don't think recognize. They think if you use personal protective equipment, you're safe. But there's a very distinct process that you have to take, getting that virus off of your body and off of the Tyvek suit and the goggles and the gloves, wherever it ends up, to make sure that you don't infect yourself. So you have to be very strategic and very methodological, following the same process every single time. And MSF and others have found ways to do that in a way where we can have thousands and thousands of encounters inside and have an incredibly low risk of transmission to providers, which is important because in Guinea a decade ago, there just wasn't enough providers. Just as like in Eastern Congo now, there's not enough providers. We can't have them falling ill from Ebola.
And so you came back to the United States. You were self-monitoring, as everyone who came out of West Africa had to do in that time. And what happened then?
I had come back to the US. I was like remarkably shaken and sad by what I had seen, by how indiscriminate Ebola seemed to be. I would talk to people in the morning and I'd go back in the afternoon and those people would be dead. It was just hard to believe the toll just on the communities. And I came back and I was sad and depressed and spent a lot of time in my house. And my friends were convinced that I needed to get out of the house. And they pulled me out and said I should go bowling in Brooklyn for all reasons. But every day I'd been monitoring my temperature, monitoring my symptoms. I'd never been febrile, other than feeling sad and tired from working in those conditions. I felt fine. And then I woke up one morning with a temperature of 100.3, called the MSF line that was dedicated for a procedure just like this. We got in touch with the city of New York, and then I was transported to Bellevue Hospital, which was the hospital that was identified for patients like myself. They thought I was a drill because that morning they had just wrapped up some of their final preparation for taking care of Ebola patients. And it wasn't until they saw my labs a couple hours later that they realized that I was in fact not a drill. And it was around the same time that we had the initial test positive for Ebola.
Right. Yeah. And so you were treated there. Obviously, you survived. How did the treatment you got in the U.S. compare to what MSF and other NGOs were able to provide in an ETU?
Yeah. This was one of the toughest things for us as providers because in the ETUs in Guinea, we didn't have access to basic labs. We didn't have access to some of the things that we take for granted in anywhere in the U.S. And part of that was because we didn't have the numbers. We didn't have the resources. I was taking care of probably 30 to 40 patients at any point. And when I was treated for 19 days at Bellevue Hospital, there were probably 30 to 40 providers on call just for me at any point. And I was remarkably grateful for that disparity and that dichotomy in terms of access to resources never left me. And in the aftermath of that, I thought a lot about people like Dr. Sheikh Umar Khan in Sierra Leone, who was this incredible physician, was leading the Ebola response there. Like me, was a doctor, like me, had been taking care of Ebola patients. But unlike me, he wasn't offered a dose of a medicine that was in the hospital where he was at. And at one point, the FDA was willing to send a dose from Canada, essentially to my doorstep in New York City. And that disparity, that inequity in terms of access of not just like basic medical care, but even higher level medical care has stuck with me. And for lack of a better word, has radicalized me in a way that says, we know that even just improving the standard of care for Ebola patients can drop mortality significantly.
Right.
I mean, look at a couple examples. The death from the Zaire species of Ebola, the one I was infected with, and that was responsible for most outbreaks, including the 2014 outbreak, somewhere between 35, 40, 50% mortality. What was the mortality in the US of the 11 people who were treated here? It was like 18%. There were 2 people who died, one who was a delayed diagnosis in Texas, and then another who arrived much later in his illness. But all the people like myself that were flown back or that had dedicated care for Ebola survived. Now, the samples aren't the same. We were younger, we were different. But we saw with Marburg, very similar to Ebola, in Rwanda just about a year and a half ago, a place that the healthcare system has made dramatic strides in the last 3 decades, that has ICU care, that has dedicated procedures and protocols and training. They recorded one of the lowest mortalities ever for a viral hemorrhagic fever outbreak with Marburg at around 22%. And that just goes to show that they didn't have special tools. They had some investigational treatments and vaccines, but it was really just heightening the quality of care to a level that allowed for more monitoring, better lab tests, the standards of what we would expect here in the US. That in itself was able to dramatically lower the risk of death from Marburg, similarly from Ebola.
You were just talking about how those outbreaks were the Zaire species. This new outbreak in Congo is the Bundibugyo species. Why does that matter? What is different about Bundibugyo? What is distinctive or different this time relative to some of those past outbreaks?
Well, it essentially brings us back to where we were at in late 2014. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have a treatment for this species of the virus. There are some indications now that maybe the Bundibugyo strain or species is a little less lethal than the Zaire species. That being said, we have percent, I think, mortality recorded right now in the outbreak. That doesn't mean all that much if we're going to have thousands or tens of thousands of cases. I will say that we're better off in the sense that we know how to surge testing. In the span of just 2 months, we've gone from no testing for Bundibugyo to 2,000 tests a day. We're still having delays and there's still not a rapid test, but like that we've learned and done better. We have rolled out a treatment trial already of some treatments that show some promise, including MBP 134. This is a monoclonal antibody that essentially takes the antibodies from an Ebola survivor of the past, makes lots of copies of them, and then refines them so that those can be given as a medicine. And I'm hoping that this will have a good impact, not just for Bundibugyo, but this should be a pan-Ebola for all the different types of Ebola. And if this works well, this would be great for any future outbreak. And we already have vaccine trials built on the exact same platform as the FDA-approved vaccines we already have for the Zaire species. The Bundibugyo species ones are already being rolled out into phase 1 trials, which is great news. We can't have them soon enough. Hopefully within the next couple of months, we'll be able to have a big trial on the ground that's able to get these vaccines, these treatments proven so that we can roll them out at an even greater capacity. So in a sense, we're catching up as we were a decade ago, but we have a little bit more of a head start, or we're able to run a little bit faster because some of the muscle memory of treatments and vaccines and getting those things off the ground. The problem is the overall dynamics of this outbreak, despite us running a little faster, still seem to be running a lot faster than we're capable of catching up to.
Yeah, and let's dig in on that because this is now already the third largest outbreak of Ebola on record. The only two that were bigger were the West Africa outbreak started in 2014 and the previous Ebola outbreak in a similar region of Eastern Congo a few years ago, which had about 3,400 cases total. This one is now more than halfway to that, barely 2 months in, or at least barely 2 months past detection. How worried are you about where this one could go? And how are you seeing right now that kind of dynamic between the trajectory of the outbreak and the trajectory of the scale of the response? Can the response catch up at this point?
These are great questions. And I think your piece in the Times a while back on this was quite heartening. I think you and I had chatted on day one. We both knew this was going to be pretty catastrophic. When you detect an outbreak at a size that's bigger than most outbreaks are when they end, you know it's going to be bad. When you have cases in a different country, so we saw on day one a death in Kampala, hundreds of miles away, as well as multiple cases along that border. Obviously, Congo borders 9 different countries. Their borders are a great place, unfortunately, for transmission because people move back and forth across them. And so from day one, I was worried. I've become even more worried. In the past week, we've had like an increase in cases of around 25%. We've had people at the WHO saying that reasonably this outbreak may be 2 to 4 times bigger than is being reported. And I think that's probably true. And so I think quite convinced that this is going to become the second largest. And similar to many of the projections by the WHO, which said around 8,000 cases probably by September. And the worst case projection by the CDC that said by the end of next month, maybe around 20,000 cases. I don't think that those are unfortunately all that far off. And to your second question of, can we keep up with the response? If this was as simple as getting treatments out and getting vaccines out and building Ebola treatment beds and making sure we had enough people trained and making sure the money was on the ground, I think we'd already be failing in those respects. We don't have enough beds. We know that beds are at 95% capacity. We've doubled the number of beds in the past few weeks, and it's still not enough. We know the WHO has said that its call for funding has only been half met. And so even if there has been commitments by the US, it's unclear how much of that is actually going to the response. If those were our only challenges, it was going to be tough. But the reality is that I think it's going to be made even tougher by the dynamics of how quickly this is spreading. The fact that the problem is not just epidemiology, but it's also conflict, that it is complicated by the instability in the region. This is a place that I have worked a bunch over the last 15 years. I have spent a lot of time in Goma, in the Kivus. I remember working in Masisi and working with local organizations, but making the mistake of hiring people who were local to Masisi but had lived in Goma, as opposed to hiring the people from Masisi who lived in Masisi, and how much community pushback we got from that, and seeing the physicians now striking over lack of pay. And really, it's like essential interventions that we've learned are critical to ending outbreaks in the past, just not being able to manage those bigger kind of shifting dynamics. It's going to make this so much harder in the background of a virus that is transmitting remarkably well in a place beset by conflict, instability, lack of access to good healthcare, all those other things that make an outbreak bad.
Yeah. So this is now a declared official public health emergency of international concern. That is a WHO designation that basically means this is a huge problem. It is the first such declaration since the Trump administration withdrew the U.S. from the WHO, since USAID was shut down, along with then a lot of its programs, including programs in Eastern Congo.
Right.
It's also a war zone with hugely complicated politics, as you've just been describing. How do you see those factors playing into what we've seen so far in the late detection and the initial response?
It's a great question. I think this would have been a difficult outbreak to tackle under ideal circumstances for all the reasons you just mentioned. But what has happened over the past year and a half, and how, quite frankly, the U.S. has abdicated its leadership role in global health, has only made this worse. And let me articulate a bit why. For every Ebola outbreak since the 2014 outbreak, the U.S. showed up. USAID said, you were responsible for sending DART teams, for sending these experts. The CDC showed up and helped with logistics and to make sure that the epidemiology was right and we were doing contact tracing, all those things that are really hard. And the first time we didn't show up was in February of 2025, when there was an Ebola outbreak, Ebola Sudan, the Sudan species, in Uganda detected. And thankfully, the WHO in Uganda stepped up. They were able to minimize the size of that outbreak. And this was the same time that DOGE was kicking off and was cutting USAID contracts. This was when Elon Musk was at his first presidential cabinet meeting saying, cut accidentally, very briefly, Ebola, but we turned it back on.
Yeah, which they didn't.
Back next day, canceled many of the contracts that would have helped respond to Ebola in Uganda. And so I think we are seeing the ramifications of that. Now, people might not be able to draw the direct line between 1 and 2, but thankfully, my friend Les Roberts, who has worked in Congo for decades, has worked measuring mortality for decades, was in the Kivus in the direct aftermath of this and said, I am going to measure the impact of the loss of USAID, USAID's role in making sure the pharmacy was stocked, making sure humanitarian organizations had the funds and support they needed. And he did a study that's going to be published in BMJ that's going to show that there was a doubling of mortality in the first year of the Trump administration, a doubling of mortality. Now, why does that matter? That means that 300,000 more people died than otherwise would have in a place where baseline mortality is high. But think about why that really matters. It matters because if you are a mother and you have kids and you've seen them die of diarrhea and pneumonia in the past couple of years, but have only seen that get worse over the past year, the threat of Ebola may take second or third priority when you're thinking about what's more likely to kill your kid today, because there's not malaria meds at the pharmacy, because USAID used to be helpful in making sure that they were there. There's not a humanitarian organization staffing that clinic that used to be in your community because the support from the US, from USAID is not there. It makes it that much harder to get community buy-in, to get trust. At a moment when there's so much conflict and instability in the region, any tool like losing USAID, losing IRC, losing other kind of US supported structures that had long been present, had been in communities and had built community trust. Losing any one of those is only going to make this outbreak worse. And I think it's exactly what we're seeing. The loss of those institutions that support that presence in community is making it that much harder for us to get in there to rebuild that trust and to make sure we can use that as a way to help navigate an end to this outbreak.
International Rescue Committee and other NGOs have talked about all the clinical capacity they had to shut down over the past year. And so you can imagine how that looks to a community member, maybe a displaced person, someone who's been displaced multiple times, probably given what's been happening in Eastern Congo in recent years.
Right. Yeah.
And the clinic that may have saved their kid who died last year from malaria shut down. And now the international community rolls in once again, not for everything that they need, but just for this one specific disease around which there's a lot of politicization, a lot of rumor. And I think that point on the continuity of presence and programming is one that's really critically underappreciated. When we were building the USAID response in Liberia in 2014, a lot of the programs, burial teams are a great example. We worked to build the safe burial teams through existing NGO partners and community partners who were known to those communities, who were familiar, who already had the trust and the confidence. And we had this phrase, you can't surge trust. So we had to piggyback on other trusted entities, and a lot of the comparable partners and capacities that would have been in Congo even 2 years ago got shut down by DOGE.
I think that's right. You can't surge trust. And even going back into a place where a year ago we left and then trying to get people to trust us again, there is no reason why they should or why they would. And I think on top of that, to say you've pulled out all of these resources, but now you're coming back for the one thing that you seemingly only care about, we're going to trust you even less. And it makes it that much harder for them because in the background, their kids are still dying of diarrhea. Their kids are still dying of pneumonia. And even in West Africa a decade ago, the impact of Ebola on non-Ebola care meant that as many people probably died of malaria that was untreated as Ebola. People see that on the ground. And from the outside, our gaze says, why don't these people just take this seriously and stop burying their family members? But from the inside, which are clinics that are closed, the meds that are no longer available, and that capacity and support that they're telling you they want from your community, but are not willing to give back or have yanked back, there's no reason for us to expect that communities would react other than exactly how they have been.
That's right. So we have a trust deficit. We've got a conflict. There have been the aid cuts. USAID is gone. WHO and CDC are much weaker than they were a few years ago. Is there a path back? How do you see the world getting on top of this? Where do we go from here?
Man, this is tough.
I'm asking you that question because I don't know the answer to it.
Let me start with, because I do think that the U.S. is a big part of the path back. It needs to be.
Yeah,
and
agreed.
I have said that there is opportunity entropy. I hate the entropy of the moment. I think our abdication of our leadership on the global stage for things like Ebola, but for other global health issues is both incredibly depressing, but it should be clarifying in terms of what we actually want to build when we can. And I will say, looking at the way the U.S. is approaching this idea that we can keep disease out at all costs, that we can build a wall tall enough, thick enough, wide enough, that it will prevent Ebola from coming in, is, I tell you, as someone who has been humbled by this virus many times, is a losing strategy. And so the approach of one saying that we're going to prevent even long-term permanent residents and green card holders from coming back to the US if they've been in any of these countries is a step further than we've ever taken in terms of funneling or trying to monitor for disease at airports. If that were it, that would be, I think, silly and shameful enough. But within the past 72 hours, we've seen an escalation. The U.S. Embassy in Kinshasa is saying, do not travel to Congo for any reason, bolded, underlined. And it's not like people are traveling to Congo, quite frankly, for fun. This is a clear message to Ebola providers, NGOs, responders to say, you are going there at your own cost, at your own risk, and we may not be able to help you. So imagine you are responsible for duty of care at an NGO in New York or in DC, and you are sending people to try and tackle one of the biggest Ebola outbreaks ever. And your biggest challenge is actually your own country, making it hard to know what will happen if one of your staff is exposed. Will they be stuck in Congo? Will the U.S. try to negotiate to send them to some hospital in Germany, or will they be sent to some airstrip in Kenya? Will they even be allowed to come back home? That, I think, is one of the biggest challenges right now.
To say that U.S. citizens cannot come back until they spend 21 days in some other third country. Apparently, that third country is safer from Ebola than the U.S. is with the same person. I mean, it's basically just saying we will happily displace this risk onto someone else. Doesn't show much confidence in the U.S. health system either. No, it's an insane and defeating strategy. Yeah.
Look, the only upside of infections like mine that were treated in the U.S. at 5 hospitals across the U.S. a decade ago was that in the aftermath, we said we are going to build and sustain a system to treat high consequence special pathogens like Ebola. We will spend hundreds of millions of dollars as a country to do so. And as of today, we have 13 centers all across the U.S. that train every single day, that nerd out on things like aliquots and testing. And right now, we are not only under leveraging that system by sending Americans to other countries to do the thing that we morally should be responsible for doing, we are wasting the resources that we put into this system. And I worry that not only wasting these resources, but we're losing an opportunity to show the American public what we have built, what we're capable of doing, also as a way so that we can continue to sustain this going forward and people see it as a wise investment, because otherwise people will say, what the hell are we spending all this money for? There's no point in keeping this system if we can just send people to Frankfurt or somewhere else to do what we should be morally responsible for doing.
Absolutely. So a question to end on. One of the things we try to do with this podcast is to puncture disinformation and misinformation. So is there anything out there that you would like to set the record straight on?
There's a whole host of things I want to set the record straight on. But I mean, the one thing that I will say, just to wrap up your last question, because I'm not sure I fully answered it, but look, I think there's an opportunity here for the U.S. to lead again, and I'm sure that we're going to lead again. And I am fully convinced that the majority of Americans still believe in empathy. They do not think that it's toxic. They do not believe that caring for others is short-sighted. And I do believe the apocryphal Alexis de Tocqueville quote that America is great because America is good. And when America stops being good, it stops being great. I do believe that the majority of Americans still agree with that. And so I think that is a truism that has not yet punctured through, I think, a lot of the policies of this administration. And I'm hoping that people will see that reality and recognize that is how the majority of us actually feel. We have a responsibility to help, not just out of selfish concern, but because we are good people. And I remember a decade ago, newspapers would just write about how ignorant people in Africa wouldn't just stop doing these burials and getting people infected. And why is it that these people can't realize that Ebola is actually real? And they keep saying it's not like all of these things that we saw play out almost exactly around COVID in the US and many other places. It needs to be remembered that we are all people dealing with our own unique challenges, but in very similar ways. We're scared by things we don't understand. We need access to the resources, the care to take care of our family, and that's who we care about most in the moments of their illness. And that the same things are going to emerge when we're afraid, we're scared, we don't have access to those things. And I hope we can see the similarity across outbreaks, across people, across countries, and how we respond to things like this. And hopefully that compels us to surge the people, the supplies, everything that we need to make sure this outbreak ends, not just for our own protection, to make sure that the people in Congo and elsewhere are protected as well.
Beautifully said. Craig, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Jeremy. Thank you.
So we just heard from Craig about the realities of battling Ebola in West Africa in 2014. Let's now hear a quick dispatch from the current outbreak. Julien, who recently arrived in Congo as the UN's senior Ebola coordinator, has kindly shared a dispatch with us from the field on what he is seeing, how the response is going, what he's hearing from the communities that he's visiting, and what is needed to get on top of this outbreak.
Good morning. So I'm Julien. I'm speaking to you today from Bunia, and I cover Eastern DRC and the neighboring countries that are affected by the Ebola virus. My role is Senior Ebola Coordinator, which is a position which is designated by Tom Fletcher, the Emergency Relief Coordinator of the United Nations, and Director General Tedros of the World Health Organization. My job is to bring together all the UN agencies, all the non-governmental organizations, international and national, to get in and support the Ebola response led by the governments. So this outbreak is the fastest growing Ebola outbreak on record. It is spreading across different parts of Congo. It's now into Otuele and Chopo, in addition to here in Ituri and North Kivu. The response is ramping up. We've got a good response, good cooperation between government and partners. However, we need to do much more to bring that response up to scale, particularly in Ituri, so that we get a lot more people into care and being taken care of. So that's the public health challenge. But on the context side, obviously in Ituri, we have numerous armed groups. There are been numerous cases of violence, either between armed groups or between armed groups and the security forces, or eventually between armed groups and people working on the response, and communities that have, in a small number of instances, have attacked the health centers. So it's a challenging environment. However, I think we should also put that into context that the vast majority of Congolese people want to be taken care of. They want to be able to get treatment in Ebola treatment centers. And the major constraint is actually the availability of beds, any one location. So in terms of the geographic spread, we need to be ahead of the virus along the routes that the virus is taking on so that we contain it at the terminus. When you have small transmission, 1 or 2 cases, you can contain it. It's when it gets into the community, deeply into the community, that it becomes really deeply challenging, which is the problem that we've had now here in Bunia city, where we have so many cases that we have completely saturated the bed spaces in the Ebola treatment centers. We've got about 400 bed spaces here, and they're all full. In some places, we're at 120% of the use of capacity. So the challenges are, can we get the resources? There's a lot of organizations that are saying that they're going to run out of money in about 3 weeks' time. So more resources, and can we bring in the right specialized human resources? Now, there's lots of very talented and competent Congolese persons here in the East, but the Ebola response also requires some very specialized medical knowledge that is not available here, or if we did take it, would undermine the existing health system by taking people out of the existing health system. So we need to be able to bring in a lot more human resources. And at the moment, that is very difficult because there are a series of administrative hurdles to come in and to go out. And there's some countries that are closing their borders to people who've been in DRC for 21 days, which makes it difficult to find colleagues who want to come in and take on this challenge. So there's some real operational challenges for us. One of the good things is today the incident manager has initiated a call for emergency medical teams from member states, which should contribute to significantly raising our capacity. I like to go out and do visits to partners in order to understand what it is they do. How does that fit into the overall picture? What are their challenges? And what can I unblock for them? So, my community is the community of the frontline response and fixing their problems so that they can be more effective for the community themselves. So what's really tough about the Ebola virus is that because it comes from touch, it's essentially transmitted through people who love each other. So we see in the demographics, there's about 15% more women who are affected, and it's mainly young mothers. It's from the age of sort of 16, 17, you see an increase in the numbers up to about 40. It's a big bulge. And then a lot of children under the age of 5. So what's happening is people who love each other, mothers who care for their children, are touching people who are infected and then getting infected themselves, and then touching other members of their family, the people they're close to, their elders, etc., when they care for them. And so the virus goes through love. And so it's really, you visit the centers and you see small children who are vomiting and can't hold the food down and just look in a physically highly weakened state. And mothers young mothers who passed away, saw one in the community. And so it just affects families in the most terrible way, which is why we need to stop transmission. We need to get this done. And we need to make available the therapeutics which are coming online at the moment, so that if somebody does come into contact, that we can care for them, either through standard medical care in the Ebola treatment centres or with the therapeutics that are being trialled at the moment. The relationship between displaced persons and the Ebola epidemic is for the number of cases. It's not for the geographic spread. So the geographic spread is a function of population mobility. There's buses going from here through Nyanya down to Kisangani. So the virus spreads around that. There's motorcycles carrying people who are working in areas where there's Ebola going back to their homes, to the west or to the south or to the highly densely populated northern corridor up towards Aru and beyond into Sudan. So that explains the spread. At any one of those locations, if you get a concentration of population, then you'll see much more cases. And IDP sites are a concentration of population, but it's not just IDP sites, right? Now, there's a challenge around IDP sites in that sometimes the proximity of houses and people is greater, but it's more about having a lot of people in the same place. There's a lot of trust already. Here in Bunia, last week I was across at Samaritan's Purse, and about 60% of their patients are people who come to the door, knock on the door and ask to be taken in. The other 40% are brought in by ambulances that are directed by the health services. So, when you get so many people knocking at the door, that's obviously a sign of trust. Within the city of Bunia, our bed space is at 120% saturation. So that's obviously a sign of trust. So here in Bunia, where people have heard the messages and they've seen the devastation, there is a lot of trust. People are coming. Where we tend to have concern, or where there are matters of trust, it's in areas where the virus is just spreading to, where people have not yet come into contact with the virus. And there are questions about what's this? Is this real? What's going on here? And there it's true, but it's the minority. We've had occasionally violence by the community against people in the response, stone throwing and attacks. But we will stop Ebola transmission. We completely can do this. We have the tools for it and the knowledge for it. The government has dealt with 17 previous outbreaks. The challenge will be to do this as quickly as possible to reduce the mortality. It's going to be a struggle, but there is an excellent spirit of cooperation between everybody who's in the response. So I'm confident in the teams. I'm confident in the leadership of all the different organizations we work with. Getting the resources in is absolutely vital. That's going to be an immediate challenge.
So Julien just gave us an on-the-ground view on how the response is going and the challenges that it faces. And now let's turn to our conversation with Mvemba Dizolele about the wider security and political backdrop in which this outbreak is occurring. I want to welcome Mvemba Dizolele to our show. He is originally from Congo, now works in Washington, D.C. as a very renowned analyst, policy advisor, researcher on Congo issues with over 2 decades of experience. He's currently a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He has been published in outlets like the New York Times and Foreign Policy. He's testified before the U.S. Congress and the UN Security Council and served as an election monitor in multiple countries, including DRC. Mvemba, it is wonderful to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, Jeremy. It's a pleasure.
So let's dive in. We want to talk with you about the backdrop of this Ebola outbreak, the political and the security context of Eastern Congo that is making this outbreak response so uniquely challenging. There's been conflict now in Eastern Congo, of course, for many years, but it's taken a turn for the worse over the past few years as the M23 militia, backed by Rwanda, has taken over large parts of the territory in the east. So set the scene for us. What does the conflict and displacement situation look like right now in Eastern Congo, and what kind of challenges does that create?
Well, like you said, Jeremy, the conflict has been going on for a good 3 decades. And if you were to ask most analysts today what's the conflict about, it's no longer clear. It becomes literally a senseless conflict. Conflict often are driven by a set of imperatives. Originally, this back in 1996 had started as the Rwandan army trying to flesh out some remnants of what they called the genocidaire, forces that had committed genocide in 94 and had fled into Congo. But then it morphed into a full attack, a coalition of armies, mostly from East Africa, that went all the way to Kinshasa to overthrow Mobutu. And then after that, they had a falling out with the fellow they put in charge, which is Laurent Désiré Kabila. He wanted them out so he can lead Congo. That created a set of militias with the rebellion that lasted from 1998 to 2003 until the country organized the elections. But since then, the country just has struggled, particularly in the eastern parts that we're talking about. So the Kivus were the theater of the occupation of the RCD. And then up north in Ituri, where the Ebola virus had broken out, the epidemic was controlled by Jean-Pierre Bemba with his MLC, but then with other splinter groups that were supported by Uganda. And so the country has never really fully recovered from those tractations that took place then. This is the context. You can almost call it a pedigree of rebellions. You mentioned M23. Before M23-2, which started in 2022, there was M23-1, which started in 2012. And before that, we had the CNDP, which is the grandfather of the current M23. And then before the CNDP, there was the RCD. So just on that lineage on the Rwandan side. And since then, we had people who've been arrested, like Thomas Lubanga went to The Hague, sentenced for the crimes that they committed, but they've since been released. They're back in the area as well. And also we have to add into this the ADF, which is a Ugandan-run but Congo-based Islamist movement that is now also being linked to ISIS.
And when you say Ugandan-run, you don't mean the Ugandan government?
No, by Ugandan. These are the tenors of the leaders of the group are Ugandans.
And what you just laid out is a long history of a lot of ongoing foreign interference, foreign involvement. Rwanda in particular has had links to a lot of those groups, and they deny it, but they're widely seen as backing M23 right now. What is Rwanda's agenda in that involvement? What are they trying to achieve for themselves?
Twofold. On one level, officially, they say they need to create a buffer zone, particularly in the Kivus, because they accuse the FDLRs to still harboring an ideology that is anti-Tutsi. Even though in Rwanda, the usage of Tutsi and Hutu has been prohibited, Rwanda still uses that language when it comes to Congo because they say the FDLR is there to come after them.
So this is still a lingering carryover from the 94 genocide in Rwanda.
Genocide, indeed,
Yep.
indeed.
Yep.
Even though the number of the genocidaire is dwindled quite a bit. This happened over 30 years ago. Those original genocidaire at this age, they were 30, today they're in their 60s. You're not really having commandos at 60s. Now, they've had children, they've populated in the region, so you may make a case that the ideology has not died. Okay, there's a case to be made of that. But does that warrant an occupation of the huge swath of land the way it is?
So in addition to the whole history of genocide and Rwanda's involvement for that reason, there's also extraordinary mineral wealth in Eastern Congo, and that has been a factor in conflict going back many years. What is the state of play on that now? And this outbreak has occurred in the town of Mongwalu, which is a mining town. How is that factoring into both the larger conflict backdrop and the immediate Ebola response?
The big issue here, Jeremy, it's the problem of governance, right? Because you have militias running around, not literally running around, but controlling various areas of that area. Mongwalu is particularly known for gold. It has been a place where you have a lot of artisanal mining, and artisanal mining brings its own set of issues. You have violence, you have drunkenness, you have prostitution, you have a list of issues that make it very dangerous for public health. But you add to that also a weak public health system that used to be very good. The DRC was actually known for a very good public health with the zones and stuff. The structure is still there, but I think the funding and the maintenance of that system has been weakened over the years, and conflict has made it very difficult to upgrade. And that's the context that you find in those spaces. But the war itself in the south, meaning, so we have to distinguish here that there's the Kivus, where you have M23 controlling South Kivu and North Kivu. But Ituri itself is not at peace. Ituri has a half a dozen, maybe a dozen militia groups. It's hard to define sometimes what's the number you need. What's the critical number before you call it really a militia? But you have a bunch of armed groups. I think that would be the best term. Both the Kivus and Ituri were under the emergency structure that President Tshisekedi has set. So North Kivu was ruled by, before the M23 showed up, by military governor, and Ituri still are ruled by military governor. And that's the context of this.
The point on the quality of the health system is, I think, an important one. Many of the past outbreaks in other parts of Congo have been contained quite quickly. And the Congolese Ministry of Health has shown that it can swing into action very quickly, contain those within often a few tens or at most a few hundred cases. Here, obviously, very different. This outbreak is now very out of control. The last time there was a major Ebola outbreak in the eastern provinces, it also reached several thousand cases and got badly out of control. And what does the reach of the government look like? How effective are government services? How present is the government in these provinces? And how does that factor in?
The government is always present. We often say, we read in reports that the government state is absent and so on. The state is present. The state is just not delivering what you need to deliver. If you commit a crime, you'll be arrested. There's no doubt about it. So the government is present. The challenge is how much funding is going into the services that need to be funded. And you've rightly pointed, the Ebola started breaking out in Congo in 1976. And even under the Mobutu administration, they were very proactive in containing it. And it's not just Ebola, it's cholera, it's a bunch of diseases that, for in a negative way, not to say the best case scenario, but the Congolese are expert at this. They have the know-how to address it. The question is, where is the link? And that's the point you're raising. Where did it fall through? And I think on one level, there's a distraction with the war. On the other level, it's just the government not rising to the level that is required. And that's where I think the crisis with the militias becomes a problem, a serious one. Look, at this point, Bunia, that's where the government can go. I've been to Bunia a few times as a reporter in the old days. Okay, the government have access to Bunia, but Ituri is a big region. It's really big. It's a forested region. So you cannot, the roads are not that great. This is another point. The roads are not great. But we're also dealing with a different strain of Ebola. It's not the strain that the Zaire strain that has been around. This is the Bundibugyo strain. So there's a learning curve, should we say, about this strain itself. But then the other analysts will say, this is not an excuse, but the demise of USAID played a major role in terms of the warning systems that you have in place.
Your point on the funding, that even if the government is present, they're not necessarily putting in the resources. There have been health workers in these areas who've gone on strike in recent weeks because of unpaid wages, which of course is very damaging to both trust in the health system generally, but it hugely undermines the response too. And there was an interesting report in the New York Times, I think just last week or a few weeks ago, about how M23 might try to benefit from a kind of competitive governance by showing they are trying to show that they can contain the spread. They want to be seen as a legitimate authority. They've set up, interestingly, a task force on Ebola, perhaps with some Rwandan backing. How do you see this outbreak potentially playing into that competitive governing legitimacy dynamic in Eastern Congo?
I don't think it will help much. I think M23 is in need of that, obviously. A rebel group always want to show that they have the support of the people and so on. And any crisis is good for them because they will try to manage that and show that they're doing better. The Kivus overall have not been as much exposed as much to Ebola as the other place. On one level, we can say, okay, maybe it's the rebellion, but my suspicion is even if there were no rebellion, chances are it would have been controlled better because simply the administration seemed to work better in North and South Kivu compared to Ituri. As I say, Ituri is very rich in resources, but since the wars, the various succession of this conflict started, it's suffered quite a bit. Again, Bunia is developing now, but for a long time, it was very downtrodden. Remember, Bunia is the place where the UN had been evacuated in 2006 or so. The UN actually had to run out of there. The French had to intervene with Operation Artemis, if you remember, at one point. It was a big, serious problem over there. So Bunia is recovering slowly, but once you start going to the interior of Ituri, there's no access there. So I think the challenge was the government should have cordoned off roads, for instance, because there's still free circulation of goods and people around Ituri. So how do you monitor people? Those are the kind of challenges. To come back to the legitimacy of a group like M23, their legitimacy will depend on how the people in the Kivu perceive them. And as far as I know, they're not perceived that great. It's still a rebellion. So it's very hard for M23 to generate any kind of legitimacy from the. One more point I'll add, Congo participated in the World Cup. And when Congo won, when Congo beat Uzbekistan, large crowds of youth came to the streets celebrating the victory, but they were shouting Tshisekedi's name. This was in Goma, this was in Bukavu. So I think we have had a data point that can tell us if the legitimacy can just spring out of managing cases of Ebola. I think that's a long shot.
Fascinating. So even in M23 occupied Goma, people, when they're celebrating the country's victory, they are shouting the president's name,
They were shouting Fachi Beton, which is like the nickname of Tshisekedi. And there are videos of this. And this was right in Goma.
Fascinating. A lot of Ebola response, the effectiveness of Ebola response comes down to trust, because the tools that fight Ebola are changing behavior, convincing people to change their burial practices, to voluntarily come to isolation centers when they have symptoms. And you have to have confidence and trust in who's telling you that, in the voices you're hearing from, in order to make some of those changes to your life. And this was a huge problem in the 2018 to 2020 outbreak in Eastern Congo, where there was not a lot of trust. There's not a lot of trust in the Ministry of Health. The government at that time, I think that was right as Tshisekedi was elected, the government canceled the elections in several of the provinces that were affected by Ebola, which also happened to be opposition strongholds. How does the government's credibility look 7 or 8 years on from that? Has any of that trust in the central government been restored? Has it recovered? And how do you think that the level of trust in authority, trust in the Ministry of Health will affect people's willingness to abide by Ebola control procedures now?
So there are two levels there, Jeremy. On one level, there's a lot of questions about government policies and all that. But it's much nuanced. If you talk about the military, if you talk about the prime minister, if you talk about different divisions. So there's that element on one level. People keep on hoping that something good will happen because they've gone to elections and they're electing people. But the trust into the health department is another story, because remember, we're just coming out of COVID. It's been only about 2-3 years that we're coming out of COVID. And COVID did not go very well, not just in Congo, but around the world. In my view, I think the powers that we mismanaged the information on COVID. Even the entire rolling out of vaccines and all that were not particularly convincing. And we see this even in a place like the US when people have a lot of information. So with Ebola, it's equally problematic now. And within the context of the war, within the context of what the Congolese will see as a foreign invasion, this last bout or this last strain has caused a lot of just distrust to plummet because people don't think, one, this is a real thing, as originally it started. If it's a real thing, who planted it here? In other words, how come we didn't have this before? How it suddenly started here? And it's happening within the context that we have discussed so much, is the conflict, right? And that conflict is not local. That's not how the locals see it.
How would you evaluate the prospects for some kind of a humanitarian ceasefire to fight the outbreak? Dr. Tedros, the head of the WHO, has called for this. Of course, President Trump, like a year ago, said he'd ended the war, which he didn't. Where do you see the conflict going from this point forward? And do you think that either some sort of humanitarian ceasefire could be achievable, or are they prospects for President Trump's deal to make some further progress? How do you see the conflict trending from here?
I'm not as optimistic, I should say. The realism of it is such as Rwanda, which is the major backer of M23, is cornered now. For 30 years, Rwanda had the free pass on what was happening in Eastern Congo. There were no sanctions to speak of. But since President Trump has come with this deal, the two deals there, right? There's the peace deal that President Trump trying to broker between President Kagame of Rwanda and Tshisekedi. And we saw the images of this, the body language of the two leaders. They didn't seem to be happy to be signing this. So for a lot of us, we're like, why particularly Rwanda is signing this? But then too, there was the strategic partnership between DRC and Rwanda, DRC and the United States, whereas the US is very interested in the critical minerals as part of what President Trump called Project Vault. And that has led to a series of sanctions against Rwanda and some Rwandan leaders. And just 2 days ago, Paul Kagame came out very defiant about the sanctions. So I think that does not put those people in the mood to have humanitarian truce. I personally believe, I've said this to my Rwandan friends, the day Rwanda decide to make peace, there will be peace in the region. It's as simple as that. Rwanda has shifted quite a bit on the reason of its engagement in DRC. I think they've come to see it as a zero sum, which it's not. I think Rwanda has a strong intelligence service. Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, has tremendous network of support still among the world leaders. What the Rwandans have not shown is the leadership in making peace. I would like Rwanda to show more leadership in making peace. And they've not shown that. They're good at engaging all around the world in a very positive way. They see that. But in DRC, they perform what I call shaggy diplomacy. In other words, like the musician who said it was not me, who denied everything, right? So if you're denying everything, it's very difficult to have peace because you never take ownership of what you're doing.
That is a very circa early 2000s musical reference, and I'm so here for it. And how would you assess what you're seeing out of the U.S. in terms of how they are trying to maintain and kind of uphold the implementation of the ceasefire so far?
I think the U.S. has gone as far as it's ever been before in this area. Rwanda has benefited a great deal from U.S. and EU support, and the U.S. has marked itself from that, right? The U.S. says, we're going to have peace. It's driven by different interests. It's not peace for the sake of humanitarian peace. It's peace because we want to be able to exploit the resources there. We talk a lot about critical minerals. One such mineral is called coltan. And the largest reserves of coltan in DRC is in a place called Rubaya, and Rubaya is being invested by M23. So for the US to exploit that, M23 has to leave. And the US continue putting pressure on that, but will Rwanda just say, yes, we're going to go along with the US? That's the difficult part because Rwanda has other options. At this point, they can go to the Qataris, they can go to the Indians. I mean, it's a multipolar world in so many ways. The question is the US willing to escalate to the next level? It's a tough one. The US has leverage to the IMF, the US leverage to the World Bank, the US has tremendous military leverage with the Rwandan themselves. The US can go to the other route. The US have been very slow in sanctioning leaders, but we saw Bashir was sanctioned at one point. So I think the US has a lot of things in its toolkit that it can use. I think there's a level of impatience now growing with Paul Kagame in the West. And I don't know how that's going to end. We've seen other leaders who were equally powerful, if not more powerful, like Mobutu. But there came a time when the US just said, we're dropping you. And they did. So one thing that we've not mentioned, Jeremy, I think, is the large number of IDPs in the region. I know you are the expert at this, but that also is an element, right? Because internally displaced people are always on the move. So how does this affect the transmission as well in the region that is already in conflict?
Yeah, and this is one of the huge things that we're watching closely because, of course, we're more a refugee and displacement organization than an Ebola organization, although I've personally done Ebola work in the past. But as you say, it's a huge factor. When you have 3.5 million people circulating, moving around those areas, being displaced and redisplaced by conflict, a big part of the way that you contain Ebola is by keeping track of who the contacts are of the known cases and trying to prevent them from spreading it. That's really hard to do when people are constantly on the move. So I think the displacement dimension is another huge complicating factor here, and obviously really closely tied to the conflict because it's often the behavior of the armed groups and the movement of the battlefront lines and the shifting of territorial control that produces those new IDP flows. Maybe just one question to end on for you. Part of our goal with this podcast is to combat misinformation and disinformation. So is there any misunderstanding or misinformation about DRC or anything related to this that you'd like to address before we wrap up?
First of all, DRC, because it's a big country, people have lost just sight of how big the place is. For the last 30 years, what has been dominant in the news is what's happening in the Kivus. And the Kivus represent probably less than 10% of the territory of DRC. DRC is the size of Western Europe. For our American audience, is 1/3 of the US. It's the United States east of the Mississippi, from the border with Canada all the way to Florida. So it's a huge place. The result is because it's rarely framed in its right size, we often think of it as these militia groups and these small places, where in fact, it will take you at least 3 hours to go from one end of the country to the other, 3 to 4 hours just to cross the country. So the result, I think, even with the crisis of Ebola, I think there is reason to be worried, yes, but we saw that we are punishing people who are in Kinshasa the same way we're treating people who are in Bunia. If you were to transpose the map of DRC on Europe, this is like Ebola is taking place in Norway. And yet we have solutions for people who are sitting in Kinshasa, in Portugal.
You're banning travel from Portugal over an outbreak in Norway, basically. Yeah.
In Norway. So now we can say, yeah, but we need to mitigate that. I think we need to nuance that. I have friends who work for the World Bank, people who, there's the new restriction now, no American can get to Congo and come back. But if you went to the Atlantic coast of Congo, you literally have nothing to do with what's happening in Bunia or in Ituri. And I think that's a serious misconception. And I hope that policymakers who follow your podcast will start taking that into consideration.
I'm so glad you raised that. When I worked in the Obama administration on Ebola, we spent countless hours debating about travel restriction policy. And we ultimately decided not to put a travel ban, a comprehensive travel ban on the West African countries that were fighting the outbreak, because there were other ways that we could manage it and manage the risk. And I think the current administration has just taken this very broad brush approach to banning all travel from Congo. And what you're talking about here, this new requirement that anyone who has set foot anywhere in Congo has to be in a third country for 21 days before they're allowed to enter the US. There's no science behind that at all. And it's nuts. And as you say, it tars the whole country with the same brush when it is the equivalent of an outbreak in Poland resulting in travel bans from Greece or something like that. It is just nuts and totally unscientific. Mvemba, we could go on about Congolese politics and security issues for another hour or two, I'm sure, and would love to have you back on someday to do that. But in the meantime, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been an honor. Pleasure.
And now for the news roundup of a few other displacement stories that we're tracking this week. So starting in the US, there have been multiple new deaths at the hands of ICE immigration authorities over the past week. In Texas, Lorenzo Salgado Araujo, a father, husband, and beloved neighbor who was in the United States for more than 30 years, had built a life here, had children here, after coming to the United States from Mexico, was fatally shot by an ICE officer in Houston on July 7th. Just a few days later, on July 13th, ICE agents shot Joan Sebastian Duran Guerrero in Biddeford, Maine, other end of the country, but similar story. He was an immigrant from Colombia who was here legally with a legal work authorization. He was known to be a very hard worker. He was also a loving partner and father to his wife and 3-year-old daughter, who were there at the scene and had to see his lifeless body amongst a crowd of ICE agents just immediately outside their home. An absolutely horrifying story. There have also been several other deaths of detainees who were in ICE detention and did not seemingly receive appropriate treatment for medical conditions. So it's a very bad situation, a particularly horrifying week. And this kind of violence, and particularly these shootings, are one of the most visible ways that the Trump administration is assaulting migrants, whether documented or undocumented, and militarizing their enforcement operations. Calling it enforcement, frankly, is a misnomer because this is lawless behavior. It is not law enforcement behavior. It is a product, as we're learning, of some of the irresponsible recruitment of new ICE officers by the administration. Some of the information that has come out since about the apparent shooter in Maine were reports from several of his multiple ex-wives that he had serious mental health issues and a history of threatening and abusive behavior. So we at Refugees International continue to call for justice for these victims, as well as the others who have been killed or left to die by ICE enforcement behavior over the past year and a half, including Renee Good, Alex Preddy, Ruben Ray Martinez, Nurul Amin Shah Alam, and the numerous others who have been victims of ICE's lawless brutality. And in the show notes, you can find our statement calling for a full and independent investigation in these recent deaths. Next up, turning to the other side of the world, one story that you may have missed comes from Southeast Asia, where more than 500 Rohingya refugees may have died in recent weeks after 2 boats capsized during dangerous sea journeys. Let's take a moment to hear a clip from a Refugees International partner and former refugee fellow here, Lucky Karim, who spoke with this latest incident last week with Al Jazeera.
These individuals, these are not the decision or the choices made by people willingly. These are the only options that the people have to take and are forced to take, forced to choose. People on a survival mode, and these are the only options available to them. People are just traveling to wherever they see an option and whoever is offering them to just get on a boat to save their lives. They have no access to, or maybe limited resources and access to humanitarian aid while still in limbo. They're in Rakhine State in Myanmar. For those in IDPs, for those stuck or displaced in refugee camps as well. And it's very, very limited production resources as well. People are dying from hunger and violence.
Thousands of Rohingya have died on similar sea journeys in recent years as the Rohingya crisis approaches its 9-year mark. And I think what Lucky talks about there shows and underscores just the level of deprivation and desperation driven by the Trump administration's humanitarian aid cuts and the way that is forcing people to take enormous risks when leaving home and searching for other places where they can meet their basic needs. Refugees International issued a statement on this on our website, and you can find that in the show notes. We are also approaching the annual Rohingya Genocide Remembrance Day on August 25, and we will focus on that crisis and the ongoing displacement and violence against Rohingya refugees in an upcoming episode. Finally, we flagged in our last episode the very damaging recent Supreme Court decision about people who had been granted temporary protected status, which, as a reminder, is a status under which people in the United States are protected from being sent back to an unsafe home country. About 1.3 million people in the United States have that status right now. And the Supreme Court decision affected primarily people from Syria and Haiti. As we are recording this on Monday the 20th, it is expected that TPS for people from Haiti will formally expire this Friday, July 24th. That is when U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the U.S. government arm, is set to terminate their work authorizations. And at a time when politicians continue to weaponize migration, TPS is an interesting issue, particularly for people from Haiti, because it has actually had a strong degree of bipartisan support, both among leaders on Capitol Hill and across the country. The House had passed a bipartisan bill, H.R. 1689, that would require the Secretary of Homeland Security to designate Haiti for TPS through 2029. And if this passes through the Senate, it would mean that the more than 300,000 Haitian TPS holders won't be forced back to Haiti, which, of course, is a country that remains in extreme crisis. There are 1.5 million people still displaced there. There have been murders of some prior deportees who the U.S. has sent back to Haiti. And, of course, there is ongoing hunger and violence and insecurity there. There's no way in which Haiti can plausibly be considered safe for deportation or return. So again, as we said last week, we urge you to go to our Take Action page on our website, and we will also put the link in the show notes, and write to your senator, urging them to co-sponsor this legislation and bring a bill to the floor for a vote in the Senate to protect our Haitian neighbors. And we will do a deeper dive on this topic of TPS and the risk of revoking it in an upcoming episode. That's everything from us for this week. Please join us again next time. Thanks so much for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe to Forced From Home on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the episode, consider donating to support our work at refugiesinternational.org or the link in our show notes. For more, follow Refugees International on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and stay tuned for more Forced From Home episodes coming soon.